Guys, BuildZoid here, and so today we're going to be taking a look at the first set of results from the Probinator-8700 on a bunch of ITX motherboards. So these are all the ITX Z390 motherboards I have. Why am I doing ITX first, and why aren't we doing like a whole video with all of the boards at once? Because I want to pay attention to kind of like every board and the design of every board, instead of just like, I know a lot of people are just like, BuildZoid, we don't care, we just want to know what the best motherboard is. Well, sucks to be you, because I don't do that. No, I really want to kind of look at like the differences between all of the different motherboards, and I sort of wanted to just split them up into categories of like 2 to 3, maybe 4 boards, so that we can really look at like 4 motherboards and not have a video that's like 3 hours long, because otherwise, like, there's a lot of motherboards that I am testing. Unfortunately, so basically the groupings that I currently have is ITX. The best motherboard from the ITX grouping will end up getting compared against a bunch of the other motherboards because, well, it's the best. So, you know, like we're gonna keep the top motherboards to their like sort of own. Well, for other comparisons. But yeah, so we have the ITX boards, then we're going to have the extreme overclocking boards, which I only have the Gene, and I have the Dark for that. And then we're going to do all of the ATX Gigabytes, which are going to be the Master, Pro, Gaming 7. So Z370 Gaming 7. So yeah, that's actually all of the Z390 motherboards I have. I am not interested in more Z390 motherboards as it is. I already don't have like a ton of space, and I feel overwhelmed with how much stuff I have to work on already. I really don't need more motherboards to test. I feel like I'm like, yeah, it's just, yeah, especially because this is pretty time intensive, as you can clearly see. I am testing quite a lot of things. So all of the motherboards here are running 4.1 gigahertz CPU core clock, 4.6 gigahertz on cache. There's no AVX offset, and the reason why we're running these relatively low clocks is because we don't actually care about what kind of clock we can hit. We care about like what does the VRM spit out, and you know, if I have to change the frequency, depending on how much droop the VRM has, then it's just, no, that does, like, it's not going to work. Like, I want to keep the clock static, and we're just going to change the LLC. The voltage is also, like, every single board is set to 1.42 volts. The idea here is we get to kind of see what kind of different, like, you know, the differences in understanding the meaning of 1.42 volts depending on the motherboard, which, yeah, so that's kind of interesting to look at. This, like the software readings for all of these motherboards don't line up either. So it's just like, and I didn't bother to note down all of them, but the thing is, well, we'll get to that later. But basically, all of them are just set into 1.42 volts in the BIOS. Whatever that produces with whatever combination of LLC is whatever we get. And I do have another test idea planned for the future where I'll probably take like sort of the best configuration of each motherboard from this testing and then try to maximize voltage while minimizing peak-to-peak performance, which is kind of like, that's the goal. that's the main, so the whole point. And for memory, I was using my 16 gig Corsair Dominators Platinum Special Edition memory, so yeah, that's Samsung B-Die. And the reason why I'm using this is because it's 3466 CL16, so in theory it should work on everything. However, I've already run into one motherboard, Gene, like, because it's freaking stupid, it doesn't want to run that at XMP just without me having to tweak anything. So that motherboard gets to run on a different kit of memory at the same settings, though. But it's like, yeah, that motherboard has me, like, I hate, like, out of all of the motherboards I have, that one has to be the, like, the funny thing is, if you have the just right memory kit for it, it works really well. If you have anything else, you're going to want to kill yourself because the board refuses to consistently post the same damn settings. Like, you can get all the way to Windows at 3466 CL16, right, with these like, at XMP, get all the way to Windows, then you restart, and the board hangs on a restart because it's just stupid. So, yeah, that board is just like way too much time and effort spent testing that one because it's just like, apparently my RAM's not good enough for it. So anyway, yeah, but that's kind of the configuration here. The scope was 500 samples. Well, actually, the results here are from an average of 500 samples, 50 millivolts per division, 20 milliseconds per division. And it's also, there was a 20 megahertz bandwidth limit. I have that on the other page, but we're not going to go there because then you'd see all the other boards I tested, and I want to keep my results to myself. So for now, right, we're going to get another video out of those. That 8700K that I'm using for this cost way too much to make one video about all of these. That's also part of it. But I do also want to pay attention to each of the different board designs, because that can give us, the thing is, if we look at in depth at each the way each motherboard is designed, then in the future, if I'm doing PCB breakdowns, then it's like, oh well, you won't, like, basically we can correlate results to what we see in the physical world, and we can go like, okay, so if we see something that looks like this, it's probably gonna suck, and if we see something that looks like that, it's probably gonna be good, right? So anyway, but yeah, so scope was on 20 megahertz bandwidth limit and 10x probe, just because that's the probe has the best performance at 10x. At 1x, it has less bandwidth. So, yeah. Anyway, that's the configuration, and I'm just gonna hide these columns. So we're just gonna hide B to D. And yeah, here are the results. And I guess at this point we should take a look at what the Probinator looks like. And also it is worth noting that, yeah, I made so this right here, VRV out being 1.367. So basically with a couple of the motherboards that actually have like on-die voltage sense readings available in software, which most boards should have, just because that's where the voltage regulator takes its voltage measurement from, but not all boards make the voltage regulator accessible to software. So you can't you can't ask the VRM, hey, how much voltage is going into the CPU. Unfortunately, not possible on a lot of motherboards. But the motherboards that do have that, I basically use to check if like the Probinator is accurate or not. And well, it ain't accurate, but it is consistent at the very least. So what I mean by that is like here we can clearly see it's measuring 1.45 volts, and the actual like die voltage is 1.37 volts. And yeah, I have no idea why that would be. It's not like the substrate of a 8700K is a incredibly thin, flimsy piece of, well, material. So I don't have any idea why they're like, basically I really wait, is it underestimated? Yeah, I really underestimated how much resistance this power plane right here, this is the V-core power plane, how much resistance is in that V-core power plane. I really underestimated that, which in hindsight, pretty stupid, because as I said, this is a very thin substrate. It's not going to have much of a cross-section for that piece of, like, the copper right there is not going to have much of a cross-section, so the fact that we're getting something like 70 millivolts of voltage drop from here to there is completely unsurprising, right? Especially because we're going to be pushing like over 100 amps in some of these test scenarios. So yeah, I have no idea why I thought this wouldn't run into that issue. Now, the good news is it is consistent in how much voltage drop there is. Basically, what I mean by that, this resistance doesn't really change. I've tested so far 2 motherboards with actual proper like on-die sense readings, and they're off, like the difference between them is like 10 millivolts, which to me is like, okay, that's good enough. Because the issue is, like, in the past when I've tried to measure from the back of the CPU socket, you would go board to board, and it would be just, like, 50 or even 100 millivolts difference, and it's just like, well, this is bloody useless. Because if the average, like, if the voltage is that far off, then you can't really compare any of the results. Like, you can't take the minimum voltage on one motherboard and compare it to the minimum voltage on another motherboard, because the voltage on the back of the bloody socket, on average, is completely different, right? So it's probably higher just because there's more voltage drop across the socket itself, or something. But here we just have the voltage drop across the CPU itself, and that luckily doesn't really change. Obviously, like, I guess what's kind of changing the results is pin contact in this area. Theoretically, this would work a lot better if I could move that red wire all the way up here, but at that point I need a custom IHS, and yeah, there's no way I'm getting that. Also, that ground wire, I would actually prefer to also have it jammed right up against the die somewhere, but there's no convenient ground plane that I'm aware of. I mean, this might be a ground plane, but that's kind of far away, so it's just like, eh. There might be a bit of ground down here. I know this right here is ground. It's not particularly convenient, but basically, yeah, I'd still need a custom IHS because I don't have a way to nicely cut out a little chunk like that, and yeah, at this point, I actually need more IHSs. So, yeah, that's kind of considerations for future generations of probinators, because I do plan to keep building these. This thing works. Well, at the very least, this is far more convenient than trying to probe the back of the socket, because you plug the scope probe into this, and it just sits there, and it's great, and you don't have to worry about the freaking probe running away on you, unlike some past setups I run. So, yeah, for future iterations, I'm going to try to look into getting something with less voltage drop, but like less voltage drop between where the probe is and the actual core is. But other than that, it works pretty okay. The main issue is just, yeah, it reads high because we're too far away from the core. And even if we were right here, I would assume we might see a different voltage than if we were, like, tried to be actually centered, right? Like, it's the issue of trying to measure really anything is just, like, you can't literally... Like, the funny thing is, even the dye-sense voltage reading is going to be different from the voltages that the actual transistors themselves see, because there is actual power loss through the wiring inside the CPU itself. So, it's just like, yeah, you can, like, somewhere there is a voltage, like, basically, if you kept digging down far enough, somewhere there is a lower voltage than what you've measured last. Yeah, and basically how important that is, like, you kind of have to decide. And I'm happy if the voltage, like, if the voltage drop's just consistent, then I'm happy with it, because, you know, if we're measuring 1.47 here, then we can assume that the voltage in the cores is pretty much the same as if we were measuring 1.47 right here, but on a different motherboard. So, yeah, anyway, that's what the Probinator looks like in detail. Here it is installed. The wire got significantly trimmed down. It's about this long, so this whole extra bit that's gone. Yeah, let's take a look at the results then. The first thing that's noteworthy is that level 1 LLC on the Z390 Phantom Gaming ITX is actually pretty droopy, because that is 1.42 volts. This is 1.45. And this is like 1.47. And none of these are actually, I don't think even this one, which is relatively high, this one still isn't technically flat, right? Because if we look at even the Gigabyte board, and this is consistent across another board, like the Gigabyte board, we can see that we have like 80 millivolts worth of voltage drop from where I'm measuring against the actual core, like the dye sense. So this right here, if we take off 80 millivolts, we're still off by 30 millivolts, right? Because all of the boards are set to hit 1.42 volts, and this is not 1.42 volts. This is like 1.39, somewhere in that area for the actual core, but still. So that's kind of that. So yeah, this explains why I could never get the Phantom Gaming ITX to pull as much power when I was trying to do my VRM thermal comparisons, because this board literally doesn't allow you to set as much voltage as the other one, like set as flat a load line as the other boards. So yeah, that's kind of annoying, and it means I need to retest the Phantom Gaming ITX, because the VRM thermals are significantly lower because it's pushing significantly less power. Who would have thought? That also explains why I was actually able to run that board with AVX and not any of the other ones, because the other ones, like, either it was way too hot or really unstable. One of the two, maybe a combination. But anyway, so yeah, like right off the bat, like level 1 LLC on the Asrock board is nowhere near as aggressive as maxed out LLC on either of the two other ITX boards. So that's kind of just like interesting, noteworthy thing. It doesn't really, like, I'm not really that annoyed that Asrock doesn't have that aggressive an LLC, because their LLC actually performs well. Whereas, like, you know, the actual peak-to-peak results are really nice. And actually, these three results right here, actually more like all of these, are insane. I've yet to measure another motherboard that does that well. No, there's also the MSI board, but basically most of the other motherboards I've tested don't get anywhere near like these results right here. The only exception to that is like these four results down here. So that is really, like, that's something that I'm really wondering about, because it's just like what is Asrock doing that all of the other boards aren't doing? Because I have boards that actually do better on like the more difficult tests, but for some reason, if we look at like the absolute minimum peak to peak results, the Asrock board is just the best, which even against like like some of the other boards, like non-ITX boards that I tested, which is just like, yeah, I have no idea how it's pulling that off. So I'll probably, like, when I plan, like, I did say that I have another round of testing planned. When I do that, I'm probably gonna be I'm gonna retest these, because I kind of, at this point, I kind of find them suspect, because it's like, these are too low. Nothing, like, most boards don't get that low. And I guess I'd have to recheck these as well. But anyway, so the 16K Prime 95 test, this is a pretty steady state load. So what I mean by that is basically Prime 95 runs, and what causes that big transient peak to peak is we get the Windows event timer ticking over every 15.625 milliseconds. Though eventually, like, it speeds up to like once every 1 millisecond, which is just like I don't actually know what triggers that. It's just something with the operating system. If it runs for longer, eventually it just starts running at 1 millisecond event timer, and then it just stays there. It never backs off. So I'm not sure why it does that, but it does that for every single board consistently. So that's, that doesn't really affect our measurements here. Now the interesting thing about so that's what's causing the peak to peak, and basically it's it's not a very difficult load in my opinion. This and you can kind of see that from the results, right? This is where we get if we sort these from Z to A. These look pretty good compared to some of the stuff you see on like 128K or 192K FFT size. But this is the hottest test. This pulls by far the most current out of all of the tests I've done, even if it is actually pretty easy for the VRM to deal with. Because it's just very steady, ignoring the Windows event timer kicking in every so often, but that happens everywhere all the time. Like the Windows event timer, like you're in Windows, like you're not going to escape from it. So anyway, yeah, so 16K, if we sort it from worst result to best result, we have the best results down here with the Phantom Gaming ITX as well as the MSI board, yeah, so we have some top results from MSI and Asrock down here. Worst results, we have Gigabyte, MSI again, Gigabyte again. But they're basically tied. Like, this is 188 average, this is 183 millivolts. These are right on top of each other. So I don't really consider these like noteworthy differences between the boards. I think the Asrock board kind of gets a bit of, well, to be fair, like if we look at where the Asrock board is, right, 1.42 volts, 129 millivolts peak to peak, it's doing significantly better than the, we have more average voltage, significantly more minimum voltage, and basically the same peak to peak as the Gaming Edge AC on these settings. Interestingly enough, level 5 LLC on the Asrock just makes things worse, which I assumed would happen with a lot of the other boards. And there are some boards where there's like specific LLC settings which are just worse than settings that are both more aggressive or less aggressive, which is like, yeah, that's really interesting. There basically seems to be LLC settings that you should not use under any circumstances because they're just worse across the board than the next nearest setting, which I'm not sure how that happens. I assume, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what causes that, but I assume it has basically something to do with like some of the other LLC settings probably aren't just a load line change. They're also a whole bunch of other adjustments to the firmware of the voltage regulator, which is why, and like, yeah, basically they change a whole bunch of other settings on the voltage regulator, which is why certain settings are basically broken as far as I'm concerned, because they spit out significantly worse performance while giving you no advantage in terms of voltages, right? So yeah, but 1.42 volts, the Asrock is basically tying a 1.38 volt MSI or a 1.33 volt Gigabyte. So that's a really impressive result. What else do we have? And then actually, but what's most impressive from the Asrock board is the 1.37 volt result, where it's doing 108. And, it's beating a 1.27 volt MSI result. It's also interesting that this is a 50 millivolt volt drop in average voltage, right? That's 1.42, that's 1.37. And yet we see a only 30 millivolt decrease in actual minimum voltage. So the effective increase in like stability would be about 30 millivolts, because the minimum voltage, this is what'll actually like crash your CPU. If your minimum voltage goes too low, then you get instability. The max voltage is kind of a concern from a degradation standpoint, but I don't work at Intel, so I don't know when that actually starts being an issue. Because the thing is, like, yes, there's a general guideline for Intel 14 nanometer that you don't run more than 1.42 volts, but there's no rule, like, there's nothing that says, like, that's 1.42 volts, like, software voltage reading. There's nothing anywhere that I can find saying if that, like, how much overshoot, like, yeah, how much overshoot you can have on that. Like, basically, and the thing is the max voltage reading, I don't really consider these results here a electromigration hazard, because this is caused by the CPU pulling less current out of nowhere. Like, that's what causes that voltage spike. So this is mostly a hazard from a sort of like yeah, oxide breakdown perspective, and I just don't know when that happens. Like, you'd have to go ask Intel, like, how much voltage can you expose a Intel CPU to for how short a time period before it becomes a problem, right? Like, it also doesn't help that we're actually measuring, like, out here. So that peak voltage we're measuring is probably going to be significantly higher than if we were measuring over here, right? Or in the actual chip. So that's kind of one thing to consider, is just like, yeah, I don't know what the dangerous value for this would be. So it's like, obviously having less max voltage is better, but I don't know, like, I'm not going to say, oh, this board is going over 1.6 volts, therefore it's bad, like, it's going to kill your CPU at these settings. It's just like, well, that's not ideal, because your peak to peak overall, it just kind of sucks, right? So yeah. Anyway, so the 16K results, you know, it looks like MSI and Gigabyte are kind of tied when you have the maxed out LLCs. Asrock is kind of blowing everybody away. Even, like, yes, this is a droopier setting than the other two boards, but if you look at the actual results from the other two boards that, you know, are tying that, they're significantly lower voltage, right? Like, there's nothing that gets even, like, well, there's this MSI Gaming Edge AC 1.4 volt result at mode 3. So mode 3 on MSI is, you know, pretty close to getting the same performance as like level 1 on Asrock. So, and it's also pretty close on the actual voltage. So that's decent. Now then, the thing about 16K is I don't really consider this a very difficult test. It's very, very light compared to 128K. 192K is a, so this pulls less power. This pulls even less power. This runs really quite cool. This runs really hot. This runs pretty hot, but nowhere near as hot as 16K. But the thing about 128K FFT size is it's just big enough that it starts not fitting in the cache of the CPU, which basically means it is like the end result is this is the noisiest test that I've found. Like, there is no other FFT size that produces higher peak to peak than 128K. There are other potential transient response tests that I'm looking into for the future, but for now, it's like, if you want to basically make the CPU scream unintelligibly at the VRM about how it doesn't want current, or does want current, or doesn't want current, or does want current over and over again, like in very, you know, short time intervals, 128K is the test of choice, because it is awful. Like, it really is quite awful. And yeah, the results speak for themselves. And here we actually see MSI's VRM just kind of fail, as far as I'm concerned. Because previously, right, if we were looking here, we have MSI and Gigabyte kind of tied for the different results, right? So Gigabyte's kind of not doing quite so well as MSI in some of these, but, you know, they're not that far apart, in my opinion. And then Gigabyte has some, like, decent results down here. The main issue is, like, Gigabyte's LLC, and we run into this on on another motherboard with also an international rectifier voltage controller. So I wonder if it might be an IR thing, or if just, like, everybody who uses IR controllers just has weird tastes in LLC settings. But basically, like, Gigabyte, like, you have high, which is very droopy, and then you have turbo, which is like there's a 90 millivolt gap between those two, between those two settings, which I think is too much of a gap to be, like, basically there should be a mid step. There should be, like, a setting that gives us 1.4 volts average voltage, and there isn't. But anyway, yeah, so, you know, if we look at the 16K results, MSI and Gigabyte kind of look like they're tied. Asrock, I would say, still just kind of wins, even though I really wish they had a level 0 LLC instead of just a level 1. And so that we could test that VRM with, like, hey, what happens if you really, really put a lot of stress on it? But The fact, like, at the same time, I think it's clever from Asrock to actually restrict their basically, if you have somebody tries to run that Asrock motherboard and they just max out the LLC, like, this is still a really, like, this is not bad, right? Like, they're really, like, this is very far away from what some of the results we're seeing on the other boards. So this is actually quite safe if we just judge it by the baseline of, well, the other motherboards are worse at that, like, significantly worse in that test. Well, significantly worse if you max out the LLC. So, yeah, anyway, if we look at 128K, MSI's VRM just, yeah, it goes from basically tying Gigabyte to completely and utterly losing. You're seeing 248 millivolts peak to peak at 1.48 volts, so that's on mode 1. On mode 2, you're seeing 217, right, that's 1.45 volts. Gigabyte is doing 1.46, and they're getting 186. So there's like a 30 millivolts advantage for Gigabyte on a similar voltage level. And they have more minimum voltage and the same max, right? Like, this is the thing, is just like, yeah, so Turbo LLC on the Gigabyte board gives you basically better stability than mode 2 on MSI while running equally hot because the average voltage is basically the same, and being safer, well, equally safe for the CPU because you have the same max voltage, right? So that's kind of the thing. Though, I want to clarify, I don't know where the actual limit for safe voltage is, which is why I'm not going to say MSI fails because they have 1.6. I don't know if that's actually dangerous. So, yeah, anyway. So we have sort of so Gigabyte kind of starts winning here, which is kind of interesting. Like, they're the only, actually no, there's another motherboard also with an IR controller. I think there's going to be some trends in general with the testing where it's like, yeah, if you have like, the IR motherboards basically seem to have a really hard time with steady state and then do really well when you throw like Prime 95 128K at them. But the interstill boards just do better across the board. Like, what I mean by that is if we look at the Asrock board, right, which is all the way, like, this is the worst result off the Asrock board, and that is at level 1. The Asrock board is doing better than MSI, better than Gigabyte. Again, we have the issue of, like, the voltages just aren't that comparable because Asrock's level, like, LLC falls right between the other two, but you know, I don't think, like, if we bump this up by 20 millivolts, I really don't think it'll like start going above 217 millivolts, right? That's not going to happen. But yeah, what's kind of interesting is just like you see 129 millivolts peak to peak on 16K, and then you go to 128K and you have this massive jump where it's like 35 millivolts more peak to peak. Whereas if you look at Gigabyte, theirs actually goes down by 2 millivolts, which is just like, that's different. And then MSI is doing, you know, they go from 183 to 248, so they pick up like 65 millivolts peak to peak as well. So yeah, that's one of the interesting differences that I noticed is just like the IR boards seem to just not like steady state, and then when you throw something really noisy at them, they actually do just as badly as they do in steady state. Or like there's not as much of a, like, you don't see as much of a increase in peak to peak as some of the other boards. But anyway, so yeah, Asrock comes in at 165 millivolts, 1.44 volts average voltage, 1.35 millivolts, like, well, yeah, 1.35 volts minimum voltage, 1.52 max. Like, again, as far as I'm concerned, Asrock is winning this right here. Right, like 128K, they're winning again. I'd say basically, if we look at 16K, MSI and Gigabyte are tied. Asrock is winning. If we look at 128K, Asrock is winning. Gigabyte is second. MSI is third. And if we look at 192K, we kind of just see more of the same, where you have MSI, MSI again, MSI, MSI, Asrock, which is kind of interesting because, yeah, the Gigabyte board actually beats the Asrock board for once. And at similar voltages, so that's great. So we can say, actually, yeah, the Gigabyte board for 192K, it does better. Ultimately, I would still pay more attention to absolute worst case scenario, especially since the Asrock board, like, it gets, 2 millivolts worse, whereas the Gigabyte, like, gets, if we go from 192K to 128K, the Gigabyte board just in 128K does really badly. Relative to its 192K performance. So yeah, that's a kind of, again, just a really interesting difference that we're seeing there. I'm not entirely sure what causes that. because most boards 192K basically looks like more of this, like a slightly less bad version of 128K, and then there's Gigabyte where they just pick up 30 millivolts like basically do 30 millivolts better. What I mean by that, not pick up as in, you know, peak to peak gets taller. Pick up negative 30 millivolts there. That's how I should say that. But yeah, like Asrock is still not doing so badly that I would consider it a problem. And again, it's just like worst case scenario, Asrock is still winning, right? And I'm not like, and that's assuming like comparable voltage levels. I don't consider, like with MSI, I straight up would say I'm just ignoring the mode 1 and mode 2 results. They're just not worth considering because they're just so bad, right? Like you're going to get basically the same, you should basically see the exact same stability on mode 3 as you would see on mode 2 or mode 1, except mode 3 is going to run significantly cooler. Now, the funny thing about this, of course, is I did some stability testing with the MSI board in Cinebench, and it consistently picked up stability as you increased LLC, and I think that's because if you look at the actual steady state results, right, the difference between mode 3, mode 2, mode 1 is just like, well, it keeps going up. And Cinebench isn't really that hot. So it's just that's kind of the thing with ambient overclocking is like you don't notice a lot of the, like mode 3 should just be across the board better than mode 2 or 1. But because at ambient, ambient and you're not really running super borderline edge case stability, like edge scenario stability, a 10 millivolt increase in minimum voltage is often more useful than the fact that your peak to peak is, you know, 50 millivolts lower and that your average voltage is 70 millivolts lower for basically the same minimum voltage. So it's kind of one of the interesting things that this also brings up is just like, well, as long as the LLC is actually increasing the minimum voltage that you see, you're going to think you're actually improving stability when you're just adding a bunch of extra heat for no good reason. Because you could probably get the same stability improvement by just running mode 3 at 10 millivolts more, right? Which, yeah, I need to look back. Well, I probably need to redo that testing again. But that's something I want to investigate in the future. And the thing is, this is 16K Prime 95. So Cinebench is significantly lighter than 16K Prime 95. So again, like the minimum voltage, like the peak to peak would be even smaller for Cinebench than it is for 16K. So, you know, again, like Cinebench is just very insensitive. And so that testing that I was trying to do where it's like, yeah, we should see too much LLC actually causing such an increase in heat output that we lose stability. Yeah, you're not going to see that because Cinebench just doesn't run that hot and it's not noisy enough to really run into that kind of issue. Anyway, where was I? All right, we were looking at 192K results, and basically, yeah, Gigabyte wins 192K, which doesn't matter because they lose 120. Like they don't win 128, yeah, so that's kind of the summary. 192K MSI again loses 192K FFT size, and I have a theory on why that happens, which we'll like see very soon. And then I also did a test at idle just to see, like, you know, well, just wanted to do idle because I felt like it. And if we sort these from worst to best, here Gigabyte, like as I said, for some reason that VRM has a hell of a time dealing with steady state. I have no idea why that's possible. I actually told Gigabyte that could they look into that, because I think this is a firmware bug. This doesn't really, like, the CPU is literally sitting idle. Every other motherboard I've tested basically stays in like this range of values, and then there's Gigabyte, where it's just like it basically looks to me like the VRM just randomly freaks out when every so often while the event timer takes over, because all of the other ones, like basically every 15.625 milliseconds you get like a roughly, you know, 60 to 100 millivolt peak to peak spike, right? The Asrock is on the lower end of that. They do like 60 to 70 or 60 to 80. Whereas like MSI is in the sort of the middle where they see like up to sort of maybe 100 millivolts, and the lower limit for MSI is like around 60 again. And then there's Gigabyte, where if it weren't for the fact that there was those anomalous basically there's like one every 20 timer ticks. If it wasn't for that, like, you wouldn't be getting that really high peak to peak, but it's just like every so often there's a 170 millivolt tall spike, and I'm just like, I have no idea how that got there. I have no idea why, but it's there. And the funny thing is, it's not even on the high, like, it actually gets better on some of the higher LLCs. Like it does like on high LLC, it's really actually quite well controlled, medium and turbo too. And then if you look at like low, standard, and normal, it's just god awful for some reason. So that's really not great. But yeah, the idle test, like I wouldn't pay too much attention to these results. It's just like mostly like for me, it was just to check if the idea was basically to look sort of at the voltage drop across the power plane. So we have the average voltage, and then the fact that I was just taking the peak to peak readings anyway was just kind of like, well, you get to see interesting things, like apparently the controller on this motherboard has a problem with not having to do anything, because that's the only explanation I have. It's so like it's just so stressed out about there not being any load on the VRM that it randomly just spikes up for no reason. So yeah, the idle test, like Gigabyte's not doing so great. Now ultimately it is worth noting, so you know, if we look at these results overall, which I would basically just pay attention to 128K, you know, MSI is as far as I'm concerned, the clear loser of this test roundup, right? Because even at mode 3 where they do okay-ish in terms of peak to peak, it's at relatively low average voltage. So yeah, and their minimum voltage is minimum voltage is significantly lower than the next nearest result, though admittedly they also have 30 millivolts less peak to peak. So I guess you could just bump that up by 30, 40 millivolts and get the same minimum voltage as the Gigabyte board. But yeah, it's or bump it up by 20 millivolts to match the Asrock board, but at that point you'd actually have more maximum voltage. So like MSI, like basically with MSI, just don't use mode 1 and 2. That's the first thing. The VRM, like basically you should run mode 3 or maybe mode 4. But mode 4 is actually like, it really isn't that droopy in the first place, so I don't really see a reason why not. Like mode 3 or 4 is probably the best. With a higher core count CPU, I would actually probably opt for mode 4, just because higher core count CPUs, like this is an 8700K, it's a 6-core 12 thread, so it's not as bad as like a 9900K. 9700K is actually very similar, so, you know, yeah, so MSI, like, the mode 1 and 2 results are terrible, but we can just ignore them as far as I'm concerned. Like, you shouldn't use those LLC settings. Mode 3, 4 are totally viable. They're just not necessarily as good as like Asrock's level 1 or Asrock's level 2. Though level 2 is actually like, well, yeah, it's basically you get 30 millivolts better peak to peak on the Asrock board compared to MSI. So that's kind of that. And yes, the Gigabyte board is actually doing kind of better than the MSI board for 128K, but the main issue I have with the Gigabyte board is the VRM cooling on that board is just not good enough for this many cores and 12 threads. So, or an 8-core 8-thread or an 8-core 16-thread. It's absolutely not big enough for an 8-core 16-thread. So that's kind of the thing to keep in mind, is just like, yeah, the Gigabyte VRM does a pretty decent job of actually, like, you know, voltage regulation, but it doesn't, like, it overheats too easily. So for that reason, I wouldn't really go for that. I think the MSI, like, I think ultimately, you know, if like MSI's VRM is probably like the best balance you get, because also it's like, I'm also thinking like, okay, well, MSI's memory overclocking is nice, like better than the Asrock board. So if I was just if I had to choose a Z390 ITX board, I would go with the MSI one, ultimately, because like if you just throw a fan on the, like if you just have airflow over the MSI board, the VRM actually deals with the heat output quite easily. And also, if you're actually running mode 3 or 4 LLC, it won't be running that hot, as hot as when I was testing at mode 2, right? I tested that board on mode 2 because mode 2 is most similar in terms of average voltage to actual turbo. So yeah, from Gigabyte, which I tested the Gigabyte board on turbo LLC. So anyway, that's kind of that in terms of the results here. Is just like, yeah, Asrock's VRM is technically better than everything else here, but you know, the motherboard is more than just the VRM, and the Asrock board, when I was doing the thermal testing, definitely had an unfair advantage in that it was just running less voltage than everything else. So yeah, So I kind of need to redo the thermal testing on that board with more voltage. But anyway, now we're going to take a look at why, well, actually, so I really wanted to sort of take a look at the reason why MSI, like, you know, they do pretty good at Mode 3 LLC in 16K. And then then they go up. Like, basically, if we go, no, A to Z, right? So 134, like, they're basically tying like, they're not far off from the results that, like, the Asrock ITX board gets here. But then when you look at the results in 128K, yeah, that's a big gap between what Asrock is doing, right, and what MSI is doing. So I want to, like, that's one thing I think we can clearly see why that might be going on by just looking at the CPU socket, which we're going to do right now. So here we have the CPU sockets of all the motherboards. And it is worth noting that the Asrock board was not completely stock, because I really wanted to know what the value of one of these capacitors was. So I desoldered it and roasted it in the process. So I ended up having to replace it with one from my own collection. And this is a 220, whereas these are 68 microfarads. So yeah, the Asrock board has a little bit more capacitance on it than a stock motherboard would. But I think it's still close enough. If anything, I think this might be worse than the stock configuration because, well, I'm actually not sure. Like, I'm not sure on the exact capacitors that Asrock is using, but they're like, these might maybe have a slightly better frequency response than the 220 I'm using or something. So anyway, I'm really not sure how this impacted it. I don't think it made too much of a difference. But yeah, so Asrock, we have a whole lot of little multi-layer ceramics inside the socket, right? I'm not sure how many of them are VCore, but there's a lot of them. We're just going very roughly here. We don't actually have a lot of bulk capacitance. This is all of the VCore bulk capacitance we have, and that's just 6 560 microfarad Nichicon FP series capacitors. So aluminum polymer through holes, 12,000 hours rated. So I don't know the spec on them because these are custom parts. And then we also have some little multi-layer ceramics jammed in between the inductors over there. So that's kind of the Asrock VRM configuration. On the back of the board, we really don't see any extra, like you have what you have on the socket, but that's about it, right? There's no extra capacitors in this area for the VRM because this is all plus 12 volts. So that's the high voltage stuff. And this is for the iGPU, and that's actually 12 volts for the iGPU. That's iGPU bulk. But anyway, so you know, that's the Asrock socket. Now, I think we have the Gigabyte socket. So the Gigabyte socket, very different approach. This, ignore that. That's for the memory. That's for VDDR on that motherboard. That's not for VCore. So it's not affecting the VCore measurements at all. Yeah, so Gigabyte board, we have some multi-layer ceramics over here on the output of the VRM. We actually have the most bulk capacitors. So basically all of those legs are for VCore. Then we have a lot of little multi-layer ceramics on the back of the socket. We have a lot of little multi-layer ceramics inside the socket. I think they're slightly, yeah, they look less dense than what you have on Asrock. So I think there's probably less of them on this side, but total, I'm pretty sure Gigabyte has the most capacitors total out of any board we're looking at here. And yeah, here's our bulk capacitance for VCore. And that is 8 Nichicon FP series. These are 10,000 hours rated. And these are 560 microfarads as well. So basically, this motherboard has a 2 capacitor, like 2 bulk capacitance advantage over the Asrock. This one has the smallest bulk capacitor configuration out of all the boards we've tested. Now, if we look at the MSI board, the least, I'd say this is the least dense in-socket multi-layer ceramic configuration. For the bulk capacitors, we're looking at basically this up to here. So we have 7 total. They're 560 microfarads each. These are made by Nippon Chemicon. And, well, yeah, they're 560. I think they're rated for 10,000 hours. I'm not entirely sure. But this right here is why I'm, like, this I think is almost entirely responsible for why MSI's board picks up, like, Asrock's board picks up some 30 millivolts going from 16K to 128K. MSI's board picks up 50, right? Like if we go back to the results, which I need to go back to them, right? If we look at MSI for mode 3, 134, 189, they pick up 55 millivolts more peak to peak, going from steady loading to very noisy. Asrock at level 1 goes from 129 to 165. So to me, that's clearly just a case of like this. that's very much a case of there wasn't really that many capacitors in the first place, and they didn't even include most of the ones they did, put solder pads for. So yeah, and there's nothing else. Like really, there's nothing else anywhere on the VRM. So it's yeah, I can't say I'm particularly surprised that this board has such a big drop in performance going from 16K to 128K, because MSI just kind of they just removed all of the bloody capacitors. Like I don't know what you expect that to achieve. It also makes me wonder, like, well, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to mod the MSI board because that one's technically on loan to me, though I think MSI forgot they gave it to me because I've had it for ages. I was pretty sure they'd ask for it back at some point, but hey, at least we get to do this testing now. But yeah, it's just like, I really wonder, like, if you fully filled this out, similar to say what Gigabyte has or what Asrock has, could you get this to perform similar to like how the Asrock board performs? Because I'd expect that to be the case, right? Just because like this is just missing most of the multi-layer ceramics on the back of the socket. So yeah, that's one thing I'm kind of wondering about, and I'm pretty sure this is entirely why the MSI board does so badly on 120, like why it gets so much worse moving on to 128K, even though it does pretty okay in 16K. Yeah, what else was there? Also, I guess, well, I'm kind of wondering what would happen if you added more bulk capacitance to the Asrock board. And also, so the reading I have done on like this size, capacitors that look like that, let's put it that way, is that these actually don't perform that different from like these style SMD aluminum polymers. At least depending on the specs. Like you can get some insane aluminum polymers in this package, like 3 milliohm ESR, super low ESLs. Like Panasonic has a whole series of them which they consider multi-layer ceramic capacitor like replacements. Because I think there was a multi-layer ceramic shortage at some point, so Panasonic was like, hey, look at these. These aren't multi-layer ceramics. They're in plentiful supply and they perform exactly the same, especially if you're looking for like higher capacitance, like with, say, these. And so, yeah, that kind of makes me wonder, like, A, what would happen if we just piled on some more little capacitors, because these are great for, like, higher frequency, like, these should be better in the, high frequency range, like, in higher frequency ranges, though at the same time, it's just like, well, how much of that high frequency stuff from the CPU gets through the socket, right? That's another question, is just like, well, there's an upper, like, at some point, you're gonna filter everything that actually makes it through the socket. And adding capacitors past that point isn't going to lead to any more improvement. So I do wonder where that happens. But at the same time, yeah, I'm just thinking, well, from all the reading I've done, these should be relatively slow. So I'm kind of wondering, well, what would happen if Asrock had, like, filled, like, this empty space right here could have all been more multi-layer ceramics as far as I'm concerned. Like, they could have literally just added more of these. And I do wonder what that would do. I'm also wondering, I'm kind of wondering, like, if it would make sense to maybe just remove some of the extra bulk capacitors on, say, the Gigabyte board, because this one has the most bulk capacitance, or the MSI board, and see if that would actually make any difference to our results here, right? Because it doesn't, to me, if we just look at the fact that the motherboard with the least bulk capacitance is actually doing the best across the board in all of the tests, it's just like, well, do the bulk capacitors actually achieve anything, right? Like, why are they even there? Because evidently Asrock is getting the same results on, 6 of them as, like, Gigabyte or MSI is getting out of 8 or 7 of them, right? Or better results in some cases. well, actually, not some cases, like a lot of cases, right? Like Asrock's doing better with less capacitor, like bulk capacitors, which I guess it might like. I'm not entirely like the other issue is just like, well, I don't know what like what the actual capacitance spec of like say these is. So for all I know, this is actually kind of compensating for the fact that Asrock's bulk capacitance is just not that large. It's just like, well, we have all of these, and these are 68 microfarads each. So I don't know if these are like. This is the Gigabyte board. Yeah, so, well, no, I'd assume these are like 10 microfarads. They could be 1. If they were 1 microfarad, then I guess yes. Then Asrock's making up for their missing bulk capacitance with these. But if these are 10 microfarads, then, like, the Gigabyte board should have a significant bulk capacitance advantage over Asrock. Though I guess these might also be all 10 micro, so... Yeah, that's just kind of like, and also I'm not sure like which ones go to which power plane exactly. I know these are all V-core. I know that much, but yeah. So yeah, there's some interesting differences between the boards. I think also technically the Asrock board and the MSI board are the lowest inductance because I think this is on 300s. I think these are 220s. And these I think are also 220s for like 220 nanohenries. But yeah, idiot me didn't remember to actually like take a picture of that because why would you do that, right? Like that's just one of the last things. Like I just thought of that as like, wait, there's also an inductor difference between the boards, but yeah. Ultimately, I just kind of wanted to look at the CPU sockets, so and the capacitor configurations, and I really think like MSI should have just included these because I'm pretty like. Well, I'll see if I can talk MSI into like letting me try to fix the gaming edge because I actually like this board is actually real like it is so good at memory overclocking that it's just like seeing some of the seeing the results here like this is just like, well, that's just sad, right? Or the fact that like yeah that right because here's the thing is just like 1.31 1.35. Admittedly, you could probably make up for that with the extra voltage, but this is going to, like, the thing is, like, your peak to peak is just going to get worse as you increase your voltage. So, but yeah, mode 4, like, the thing is, at that point, you'd be, idling on 1.46 volts on the MSI motherboard, which the thing about idle, like, a lot of people think, oh, high idle voltage is really, really bad. But the thing is if you're idling, you're not pulling any current. So electromigration is like the least of your concerns at idle, unless there's some circuit that sits on vCore that runs all the damn time and is susceptible to electromigration, which you'd kind of have to go ask Intel about. So yeah, but I'd feel much less bad about idling on say 1.4. 1.44, 1.45 volts, then I would worry about like getting straight 1.42 volts load, right? Like that's kind of the thing. It's just like 1.43, 1.44 volts under load. That is, in my opinion, far more concerning than 1.4, like that same voltage at idle. Also because at idle, your CPU is cooler, which also helps reduce electromigration. So, and that's kind of like idle, you're just like, well, there's always the high max voltage, but that everybody's doing great in that department. Everybody's doing great in that department, and except like this result, that result, that result, and even those are just significantly lower than what you see under load. Again, it's just like idle is not where I would worry about my voltage. Full load, yeah, that's where I'd be worried. So yeah, that's the ITX motherboard test results. And ultimately, one thing I'm kind of concerned about with this testing so far is just like, as far as I'm aware, I'm like the only person who's ever done this done this to this extent, right? Like, because I'm sure other people have taken oscilloscopes to motherboards. But I'm not sure that anybody's taken an oscilloscope to multiple motherboards in order to do a comparison between said motherboards for like voltage regulation. So yeah, that's kind of like right now my main concern is like I have all this data, and this data says things that, looking at the physical aspects of the motherboards make some amount of sense to me, at least. Like I'm not seeing anything that's like this motherboard has the VR, like this VRM on this motherboard looks like it should do the best, and it doesn't. So I'm not seeing anything like that, and because of that, I'm willing to think, okay, the results might be relatively like real, act like, well, not like real, like a good representation of reality. But yeah, my main concern is like maybe the way I'm measuring is like compressing the results, as in like the differences, like the voltage differences that we're seeing are smaller than they should be because of the way I'm measuring things. But nobody else does this, so it's just like I'm not entirely sure. And at this point, like what I'd want most is for someone else to just come up with their like own methodology. Like you can copy the Probinator, but just don't copy anything else. Run a bunch of their own tests, and then come out with like different, like basically try to get as different results for me as I do, right? Because like I'm really like, you know, it might be just my equipment might not be like, I could run it at like unlimited bandwidth. It's just like when I was in Taiwan with at Gigabyte HQ, we were still doing all the measurements at 20 megahertz bandwidth limit. So I've just kind of copied that over. Also because if you don't run with the bandwidth limit, like you just, well, it doesn't really seem to like, well, like I'm not entirely like, there's higher bandwidth means like I could be picking up more noise that isn't the CPU, but at the same time is like, what are the chances that that's not the CPU, right? So it's like maybe I'll do another round of testing where I run, you know, some settings, not all of the settings, because here, as you can, like, I've tested every single freaking LLC level on every single board, and that's the plan for the rest of the testing so far. But like, I'm thinking maybe I'll do some retest with just a couple levels on like 100 megahertz bandwidth to see how that changes. But like, yeah, I'm not sure. Like, it might just blow up all the results by the same amount, and we'll just end up with a bunch of results that is just like, yeah, everything's 20%. Like, yeah, everything's just 20% bigger, right? So instead of like 140 here, we'd be seeing whatever 140 plus 20% is, and instead of 170, we'd see 170 plus whatever 20% is. So yes, the gap between the voltage, like, you know, which, the well, if you multiply 100 by 20 increase 100 by 20%, you get 120, right? And if you multiply 200, like if you increase 200 by 20%, you get 240. So yes, the difference goes from being 100 millivolts. The difference between the two goes from being 100 to being 120. But in terms of proportionality, like in terms of proportions, it's the same freaking difference, right? That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's just like, well, I could test at higher bandwidth, but if we just end up with, you know, everything getting blown up by the same amount, then it's just like, well, it doesn't make a difference. But yeah, like that's currently kind of my main concern is just like, I'm not 100%, like, I think the results that I'm seeing make sense to me. I'm just not sure that they're actually like, you know, I might be completely wrong. That's kind of the main concern I have with the results. And I want to reorganize this by, actually, no, I need to sort it by Z to A to Z. Bam. And then we get everything the way I want it. Yeah, because then we have level 1 to 5, turbo, high, medium, low, normal, standard, mode 1 through 8. Cool. Now it's all nice and organized. But yeah, that's kind of the main issue with the testing is just like, I don't have anybody, like basically what I want is somebody else to test like the same set of motherboards, or just like I'm testing a lot of boards. So somebody would just have to test a similar, like just a couple boards that I've tested. And if they come to the same sort of conclusions, then I can be at least confident that my measurement methodology is a good representation of what's actually a better motherboard, right? Like that's kind of the main concern is like, I don't want to say this board is better when it's not. But if, like, you know, my measurements say it's better, is my measurement wrong, or is it actually better? That's kind of the main concern I have right now. So, yeah, but nobody else does this right now. So, so it's just like, well, this sucks. I basically just want peer review for my data, because, But it's not like I want more like peer review for my conclusions rather than my results. I don't want somebody to like copy my test setup because I would assume it would spit out the same results every single time, right? Like unless I misread the freaking oscilloscope readouts, there's not really that many ways that these could be wrong. Setup to setup. I guess there could also be some variance motherboard to motherboard, but well, I do have two Z390, or I don't feel like testing or the same board twice. I do have two Z390 Aorus Masters. I could test them both to see if they're both the same, like if they both spit out the same results. Damn. That sucks. There's too much data to gather. Seriously, like already this other sheet that I have is there's like 52 different rows for motherboards, and this like these are all filled out, and those are part of those 52, and this right here is what, 19. So yeah, and there is a ton of data to gather, and the worst part is I plan to do more data gathering afterwards because I still want to do testing where I like normalize all the voltages, and at this point, oh my god, this video is long. So yeah, but yeah, I do want to do a round of testing as well where I'll just match up all the voltages, because like I want to basically see like basically I'll take like, you know, mode 3 and 4 from MSI, because I think these are the best settings for the MSI board, right? Because it doesn't really get a lot better going down, or more like, yeah, it gets better, but you just lose a bunch of voltage. I guess mode 5 and 6 might make some sense, but mode 8 really doesn't. Mode 7 really doesn't. Actually, yeah, just screw everything below mode 5. So mode 3, 4, 5, those kind of make sense to test. And, you know, level 1, level 2 on the Asrock board, because level 3, 4, 5, again, don't make sense. You get the same peak to peak from level 2. What else is there? The Gigabyte board, you know, high, well, basically just turbo and high, right? Like, because that's another, like, high, and then everything else is basically the same results over and over again. I guess you could argue for medium, but like, yeah, so basically like do turbo, high, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and take all of these settings, match the load voltage. So basically like take level 1 and lower the voltage until this is 1.4 average. Take mode 4 and raise the voltage up by 20 millivolts till it's like 1.4 volts average. Take mode 5, raise the voltage by 70 millivolts. Whoa, it's gonna be 1.49 idle. I would not feel safe running 1.49 idle. Like 1.45 maybe, but 1.49 no. Yeah, but you get the idea. Well, you know, temporary testing, so it's going to be fine. Like for testing, it's fine. It's just like I wouldn't daily that. That sounds like a terrible idea, but yeah. So mode 5, bring it up to. Actually, no, I just need to bump it up by 50 millivolts. Yeah. So don't touch that one. Bring that up that one up 50 millivolts. Bring that one up 20. Bring that one down by 20. Bring that one up by 30. Bring that one up by 40. Bring that one down by 50. And basically get them all to the same average voltage and then check the results, right? Because that's just, I'm interested in what that'll produce. Because in like theoretically, like I did a similar test sometime in the past on a different motherboard, and basically what happened is like if you just took a higher LLC and then shifted the voltage down, you'd still get the same peak to peak. So you would literally your minimum would just go down, your maximum would go down, and your actual, like basically it would be worse. Is what I'm getting at, right? Your minimum voltage would just go down. And so I'm thinking like, yeah, you could take like mode 5, keep the nice, you know, low peak to peak, and then just bring up the minimum voltage by raising raising the set voltage by 50 millivolts, which in theory should be better than trying to run mode 3 where it's just like your minimum, like, you know, it's 1.36, which in theory, so mode 5 in theory should end up at like 1.37. Whereas mode 4 would end up at 1.36. So that's actually kind of pointless, right? Mode 4, like if we bring this up to 1.36, I guess this would end up at 1.48. But at the same time, it's going to push more current, so that might increase the peak to peak, which might increase this to 1.49, which means you might that's why I want to test that, right? Like you see what I'm getting at? Like equalize the voltages, and see what that does, because that'll spit out some interesting results, I think, as well. And that's going to be a whole lot more testing. Do I actually want to do that for every category? let me know in the comments below, because this video is too long, so this is the end. So, yeah. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below, and there's also Teespring, where you can pick up HOC-themed merch like shirts, stickers, posters, socks, hoodies. Am I remembering everything? Yeah, I think I just listed off everything that's on Teespring. So yeah, there's a link to that down in the description below. Both the Patreon and Teespring help out with running the channel immensely, because trust me when I tell you that, you know, you ain't you're not telling anyone that. Well, actually, no, I think I might have a decent chance of, like, now that I've done it, I might have a decent chance of talking someone into sending me a CPU to do this with. But the first one definitely wasn't free. Like, I ended up, like, I had to buy this thing, which incidentally, yeah, thank you to the patrons for funding the CPU. Also, thank you to the guy who paid for the Asrock Z390 Phantom Gaming ITX. MSI did loan me this board, and I do have this one from Gigabyte just straight up gave me the ITX one, the Z390 ITX. So, yeah, that's where everything came from. I should have put that at the start of the video. Too late for that now. Thanks for watching.